Okay, next we move to the next subtopic, which is protected members and class access. Okay. Okay, in this subtopic, you'll be introduced with the protected member and the class access. Okay. For the protected member access specification, it only the derived class can access to the protected member in the base class, but remember, not their object. Okay. For the class access specification, before this, you know the private and publics. Okay, so in this part is how you want to determine the private, protected, and public member of base class are inherited by the derived class. Okay, so if you look at this, there are several of access specifier, which are public, protected, and private. Okay, so for the public, object of derived class can be treated as an object of base class, but not the base class. Okay, not the other way around. Okay, for the protected, more restrictive than the public, and for the private, of course, it prevent object of derived class from being treated as objects of base class. So we will discuss this more details after this. Okay. Okay. So for this parts, you have the member accessibility, which are two area, which is inside the class and the derived class. Okay. So when we want to access the member inside the class, we call as the class access specifier. And if you want to access from the derived class to the base class, we call as the inheritance specifier. So here, inside the class, we call as the class access specifier, which is to control accessibility to member for each class. Okay, so for the inheritance specifier is for the child class, that is want to access the member in the parent class. Okay. Okay, here is the example in the code. So how you implement this class access specifier in the code. Okay, so if you look at this, the class of here is class access specifier in the class of student. Okay, so the private and public we call as the class access specifier. This is it can be accessed within that class, within that the class of student. Okay, so when you look at the another class undergraduate here, you can see that is the inheritance specifier. It's public. You can see there is a semicolon and public student. So this is we call as inheritance specifier. So it is actually that specifier is to control how the derived class can access to the base class. Okay. Okay, in this slide, what you can see here, how the overview of this private access specifier, private, protected, and public, using the inheritance specifier. So how the derived class can access the members from the base class. Okay, so if you can see here at the left side, is a base class member, and the right side is the derived class member. Okay, so when you can see here the private base class for the first one, so in the derived class, X is inaccessible. So even for the Y and Z, for the base class is protected and public, but when you use the private inheritance specifier, so Y and Z become private. Okay, same with the protected also. So if you are using inheritance of protected for the to access the base class, So X, Y, X also, X is private. So of course there is cannot access the private members in the base class, but for the protected, for the Y and Z, it's become protected. Even in your base class, it's mentioned the public, but when you use the inheritance specifier for this protected, both become Y and Z become protected. But if you are using public, so X is an accessible, of course, this is private, okay. The Y still protected, but you can access the public of Z. Z become public, and you can access the Z in the base class. Okay, so here you will look at the how this class access specifier, the derived class, to access to the class base class. Okay, so for example here at the right side is the derived class using the inheritance public's access specifier. So here it's using public. Okay, so here when you want from this derived class, you want to access which one that you can access. Okay, so if you look at this, when you are using public inheritance, Y you can access as a public, and Z you can access as a protected. Okay, but still X in the base class is a private. Okay, same with the second derived class. If you are using inheritance private here, okay, so all of this from the base class, Y and Z in the derived class become private. Okay, so this same goes to if you are using inheritance specifier as a protected. Okay, so if you are using protected in this derived class, so the to access to the base class, the Y and Z become protected. Okay, so next, the accessibility versus ownership. So you have to differentiate between to access and what's the class own, which member in that class. Okay, so an object owns all member from the class it was created from, regardless of private, public, or protected. So this is the inside class. So whatever members in that class, its own all members. So this different with the access. Okay. However, the object can only access to the public member. So if you the access specifier mention public, so object can only access to the public members only. Okay, so if it's private, it cannot access that. A class can access all its own members. So this is the example for the ownership. Okay, so if you can see ownership here, there is two classes here. Student as a base class, and undergraduate is the derived class. Okay, and if you look at the end of the code, student and S. Student is a class and S is the object, and the graduate U is the object of the class and the graduate. Okay, so this is the ownership. So for example, class of student, it's actually own the name attribute, program attributes, the methods of print, but it cannot access CGPA because it is in the derived class undergraduate, and it cannot own it cannot own the CGPA in the undergraduate class and read method in the undergraduate class because it is in derived class. Okay, so for the derived class undergraduate here, its own the members from the base class, which the base class is students. So the attribute of name, program, method, print, and its own also in its class. For example, here's the GPA and read method here. So this is for class. Okay, but for object, okay, so for object here same. For object as referring to object for student class, same as a class. They are the ownership. And for the object U is object for undergraduate class, same with the undergraduate class also as well. So the ownership, object, and the class here look same. Okay, but if you look at the another things is regarding the accessibility. Okay, so here there's different how you want to access is depending on the access specifier. So if you look at the class of student here, okay, it can access its own class, a name, the attribute of name, program, and the methods of function print. Okay, for undergraduate class here, since the name and program in the student class is private, so it cannot access name and program in the base class. Okay, however, print method in the base class is public, so it can access the public access of the print method here. Okay, so for the CGPA is it's owned by its class and read, so it can access its own members in the class. Okay, for object S is the object for student. Okay, so object cannot access the private members of name and program, but can access the public of print method here. Okay, and it's the object cannot access the derived class of members CGPA and read method here. Okay, for object U undergraduate, okay, object for U undergraduate class, it cannot access the private member of name and program in the base class, but it can access the public member function here, print. But object you cannot access the private member of CGPA, okay, but it can access the public member function of read here. Okay. Okay, here. It is a good idea to specify data member as protected rather than private. So what is good here is child classes can directly access to them, and while the object still cannot access to them. So this is the concept of data hiding. So the security is still there. Okay. Inheritance access specifier is commonly specified as public. Okay, so normally it's mentioned as a public. Next is where if you make the access specifier for the attributes member here as protected, okay, for the class of student and for the class of undergraduate become a protected, so it can access for the class undergraduate, it can access the name and program attribute from the student class here. Okay, so that is the difference between these three access specifier: protected, public, and private. Okay, so at least you basically you have to differentiate the accessibility and what is the ownership. Okay, all right.